Today I'm going to show you how we can remotely switch input sources on our digital signage using a combination of Signagelive Web Triggers and our very own capture card asset. In order to do this, we're going to need a couple of things to start. Firstly, excuse me unplugging my screen here, we're going to need a digital signage player that has a HDMI input. Now in this case I'm using a BrightSign XT5. Obviously you can go for any other digital signage player that is supported by Signagelive and has a HDMI input source. And secondly, you'll need access to the Signagelive Web Triggers API. Having access to this API allows you to virtually send messages or triggers from anything that is connected to the web in order to trigger content on your Signagelive players. Your Signagelive player is then able to respond to that trigger and display whatever content you choose. So in our case today, what we're going to do is we're going to feed an input source into the HDMI input of our BrightSign player here, and then we're going to use web triggers to trigger that content in order to showcase whatever we want. This is really handy if you're trying to combine various experiences into your digital signage. So let's take a top box, for example. If you wanted to combine live TV with your other digital signage content, you could then pull the HDMI output from your top box, take that into the HDMI input of your digital signage player, and then combine whatever content's coming into that HDMI input on your player alongside the rest of your digital signage content. Now, I unfortunately don't have access to a top box today, so what I'm gonna do is take the output from another digital signage player and I will then feed that into the input of my player. I'm then gonna use web triggers to switch between my default content, which you're seeing right now, and my HDMI input content, which will be whatever video is going to be playing on that other player. So let's waste no more time and we'll jump right into this. So the first thing we need to do is publish the content that we want to trigger to our player. We're going to be publishing this as an interrupt, which the Web Triggers API can then make a call to then play back that cached content. Here I am in my Signagelive network now, and if I go down here, you will see my player, which is this XT5 for Web Triggers and Capture Card demo. That is this BrightSign that you're seeing behind me right now. If I click on this, you can see I've got one schedule currently published to this, which is my default playlist. That is essentially this video that is on loop behind me right now. In order to interact with our HDMI input source, we need to create a playlist that contains a very special type of asset, and this is called a control asset. If I go up to content here, then go playlists, create and edit, I can see a control assets folder on the far left here. This folder contains some very unique assets that have particular functionalities. I'm not going to go into all of them today, but the one that we want to use is our capture card asset here. That's going to allow us to display content from that HDMI input. It's a very simple asset to use. All I'm going to do is drag and drop this into a new playlist here. I'm going to double click on it and change the duration. I'll change this to an hour. So we've got an hour of capture card content. That means that whenever we trigger this piece of content, it's going to display the capture card for an hour before falling back to this content that you see behind me. Outside of its ability to display HDMI input content, this works pretty much like any other asset. If you double click on it, you have the ability to add conditional tagging, validity, recurrence, you can alter the duration, see the details, proof of play, etc. But what we're going to do is hit save on this playlist. I'm going to call it capture card, press save, and now we're going to publish this to my player. So I'm going to go to content, publish, and now what we're going to do under the when do you want this content to play section, we are going to choose as the result of a trigger. We'll go on to this in a moment, but what we have done is built a unique interface within Bubble.io, and that Bubble.io application is communicating with the Web Triggers API that I mentioned earlier. That's going to allow us to make these remote calls via the web to then carry out actions and trigger our cached content. In our case, what we're going to do is select a start trigger. And remember this because this is important. For now, I'm going to set my start trigger as the key S. And now we can choose whether we want our content to play for the duration of the content, or we can set a configured duration. In our case, we set the asset to be an hour long earlier, so I'm just going to leave this to play to the duration of the chosen content. Therefore, it will play for the full length of the hour that we set on the asset within our playlist. The stop trigger we're going to leave as it is for now, and depending on how you're going to engage with this will depend on whether you need to set a stop trigger or not. In our Bubble.io application, which we're going to jump onto in a moment, we actually have a stop trigger programmed within there. I'm not going to set the stop trigger here in Signagelive, but if you were interacting with your player with a USB keyboard, for example, you would probably want to set your key press to something. So in my case, I could set it to T, for example. And then if I plugged a keyboard into this player, a USB keyboard, I could press S to trigger my capture card content, and I could press T to end that content. Alternatively, I can just wait the full hour that we've set for that content and then the player will fall back to the default content that we're seeing here after that duration has passed. But like I say, I'm going to leave this as none for now. Going to step 2, we're going to select our playlist that we just created that contained the capture card, which is just this playlist called capture card. On step 3, we're going to select our player, which of course is going to be the one that I mentioned earlier, which is this guy here. I'm going to hit publish. And to be honest, we're not going to see much of a change yet, because obviously in order for this content to actually be displayed on the screen, I need to trigger that content. Now going back to Bubble.io that I mentioned earlier, Bubble.io allows you to build applications. Now I'm not going to go into the inner workings of how to build an app on Bubble.io, though I have made a video on this and I'll put a link in the description somewhere so you can go and check that out. But essentially what we've built in Bubble.io is a series of triggers that look like this. Now, what we're seeing here is a web page that we can access, and in my case, I'm just accessing it from an iPad. I have particular buttons that are mapped to particular key presses using the Web Triggers API. So in my case, I can set a button to talk to whatever trigger that I've set within Signagelive. But we're going to create a brand new button on this page that is going to interact with the content that we've cached for this player. So in the instance that this button corresponds with the trigger S, it's going to trigger the content. But before I do anything else, the first thing I need to do is feed a HDMI input into my player so that when we trigger that capture card asset, we're actually displaying something in that HDMI input. And like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to use the HDMI output of another media player and then plug this straight into my HDMI on my BrightSign. So here's my HDMI cable. I'm going to quickly go and plug this into my player over here. So I'm going to take the HDMI output of here, and then I'm going to feed that into the HDMI input of this guy over here. And there we go. Of course, we're not going to see anything yet because I haven't actually triggered the capture card asset yet. We will only see content coming from that other player when the capture card asset is on screen. And of course, we're going to trigger that experience so that that happens. Okay, so much like the user interface that you're seeing here on the iPad, I've now got this loaded up on my laptop here. Now, what I can now do within here is, of course, trigger experiences that I've already got existing here. But what I want to do today is map a trigger that will talk to the interrupt that we set up earlier. So in Bubble.io here, I'm going to scroll down and add a brand new button. I can name this interrupt, so I'm going to call this capture card. I now need to choose what the interrupt is, and of course in our case it was S. We want to make sure that this matches exactly what we did over in Signagelive. In terms of players, I will get a full list of all the players in this room that I'm in now, and this is because this has been pre-configured using the Web Triggers API. That allows me to map data, and by data I mean Signagelive players, functionalities, and etc. into the Bubble.io app. That is of course unique to whatever Signagelive network you're using, and in my case it is the Signagelive network for this room that I'm in now. Scrolling down, I need to go to this player here, which is the player I mentioned earlier in this video. I'm going to hit save now. Now if I click on the hamburger menu in the top left here and go back to triggers, I can now scroll down and you can see that I've got my capture card button there. Now upon pressing that, that will trigger my capture card asset that I'd set up earlier. But before I do that, I need to set up one more trigger. And of course that is the trigger to stop this content. Because if you remember earlier, we set this content to run for an hour. So if I start this content, I'm gonna have capture card content on screen for an hour. And then after that hour, the player will naturally fall back to what you're seeing here. But if I want that to happen sooner, I need to set up a trigger for that. So that's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna hit this button here again. And now this time we're gonna call this stop capture card, like so. So in our case, under the interrupt drop down here, we're going to scroll down and select stop. Press save, and now we should have two brand new triggers. You can see that I've now got the two buttons there, capture card and stop capture card. And I can trigger these from either on my laptop here or I can trigger them from the iPad here. But without further ado, let's give this a go. Now I want to start my capture card asset, so I'm going to press the button to do so. Upon doing so, we will be switching to the HDMI input of this player here, and therefore displaying anything that is coming into that HDMI input. I'm going to press the button. And now you can see I've got a video that's now triggered behind me. Conveniently enough, I've set a video here that is actually about web triggers. And this will continue to loop until the duration comes to an end on the capture card asset itself. But also in my case, I programmed the button to stop this trigger as well. So if I press my stop capture card button here, we now fall back to our default content on this player. But there we have it. Using Signagelive Web Triggers and the capture card asset within Signagelive, we've been able to switch from our default content to our HDMI input content completely remotely. Now obviously today we did this with an iPad, but really you can do this with anything that can interact with the Signagelive Web Triggers API. Whether that be a physical button or a lift and learn solution, as long as it has that web access and it can access the API, you can send triggers and outbound messages to your players that they can then interact with and display your content accordingly. If you want to be able to do this yourself, head on to the URL listed on screen now and sign up for access to the Signagelive Web Triggers API. And upon doing so, you'll be able to pair your Signagelive network and all the players within that with any solution that can interact with that API and create these external digital signage experiences. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, please do get in touch and we'd be more than happy to help. And with that, I will see you on the next one.